Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you all joining us tonight for the third edition of the Terran Summit titled Chthonic Realism, Summoning Ghosts and Monsters. My name is Erfan Riasi, and I'm the co-curator of the Summit of Two alongside Una, Matisse, and Yereda. This summit is a collaboration with Pachinko, an artist-run space based in Oslo, led by Mathilde Karbel and Christian Troder. I would like to also thank Frieze Foundation and Art Council Norway for their generous support. Co-founded by Gazelle and I, the Tehran Summit is an independent artist-run project based in Tehran. Due to the travel restrictions to Iran, we utilize online platforms to invite prominent international artists and thinkers from diverse backgrounds to share and exchange ideas. Over the next 7 nights, we will gather for a series of Shab Nishini, which is a Farsi word for soirees, to listen to the invited guest speakers. It is my greatest honor to open this series of Shab Nishini for the Summit 02 and to host one of the most important social engaged artists, none other than Coco Fusco. Coco Fusco is an interdisciplinary artist, writer, and professor at the Cooper Union School of Art. She is a recipient of numerous awards, including Guggenheim Fellowship and an American Academy of Arts and Letters Award, Latinx Art Award, a Fulbright Fellowship, and Herb Alpert Award in the Arts. Coco's performances and videos have been presented in 56th Venice Biennale, Frieze Special Projects, Basel Unlimited, 3 Whitney Biennials in 2022, 2008, and 1993, and several other international exhibitions. Her works are in the permanent collections of the Museum of Modern Art and the Art Institution of Chicago, the Walker Art Center, the Centre Pompidou, the Imperial War Museum, and Museum of Contemporary Art of Barcelona. She is represented by Mendes Wood DM. Fusco is the author of Dangerous Moves, Performance and Politics in Cuba, 2015. English is Broken Here, Notes on Cultural Fusion in the Americas, 1995. The Bodies That Were Not Ours, 2001. And A Field Guide for Female Interrogators, 2008. Tomorrow, I will become an Iceland, a touring solo retrospective of Fusco's works opened at Berlin's KW Institute of Contemporary Art in September 2023, accompanied with a monograph published by Thames and Hudson. I'm so happy that you're here, Coco, and it's a great honor to have you and open the summit with you, and the floor is yours.
Well, hello, everybody. Thank you for being here and for making time for a conversation. I was asked to, fill in a lot about my work, but we only have a limited amount of time. So what I thought I would do is to focus on 3 different projects that have to do with the idea of ghosts and monsters or the monstrous, just so that I could find a way to connect with the thematic interests of your summit. So I'm going to share my screen. Hold on just 1 second. Let me do this. Okay. Do this. Okay, can everybody see? Because yes. Now I don't see you because I only see the PowerPoint. Let me see if there's something I can do to.
You can minimize your window.
Yeah, let me see. I have to go back. I'm not sure how to minimize my window. Do you know?
Yeah, there's this. You're using Mac or Windows? Mac. So you go you move your mouse to the top of your desktop.
Right, but I don't. It's not working. Anyway, you know what?
Okay.
I don't want to waste time on this. So let me do this, which is to if you I don't know if you can put something in the chat or you can just talk to me if there's something that, if somebody needs to interrupt, okay? Like if there's something that I said that people don't understand or whatever. And while I'm talking, if anybody has questions, what it would be probably the best way to handle that is if you can write your question in the chat, and then when I finish the presentation, then I can go through all the questions and address them. Okay? So I wanted to talk about what of mine relates to the idea of the monstrous or ghosts, and these are just some examples, general examples from the last 35 years of works of mine that have to do with being different kind of interpretations of the monstrous or monstrosity or otherness, right? A monstrous, barbaric otherness, savage otherness, evil otherness, or interspecies otherness. So I did for 3 years run around the world pretending to be Dr. Zira from Planet of the Apes. I don't know if you all are familiar with the film series. The sequels seem to appear every few years, but I was interested in the original version of the film because this character, Dr. Zira, is a woman scientist, chimpanzee. She studies humans the way that human beings in our world study non-human mammals. In other words, she studies human psychology. And she's also a political activist, a pacifist, and a feminist. And so I thought, well, I feel a great kinship with her. At the time, I was looking for a way to talk about gross economic inequality and the ways in which bankers on Wall Street had essentially stolen billions of dollars from people in the 2008 crash. So I developed this piece after Occupy Wall Street in 2011 to talk about predatory lending and predatory banking by that social class. And then Me in the Cage with Guillermo Gomez Peña. This is a very early piece of mine that, a collaboration with Guillermo, where we pretended to be Amerindians from an island that had never been discovered by Westerners, and that for the 500th anniversary of Columbus's voyage to the Americas, we wanted to finally be discovered by Western civilization. And so we went on a tour in Europe and different parts of the United States and Australia, so that Westerners could see us, but we presented ourselves in a cage. And then after the invasion of Iraq and the subsequent development of these black sites and military prisons where alleged Islamic terrorists were being held, and the evidence that was coming out of torture of these prisoners, specifically the Abu Ghraib photographs of abuse at this prison in Iraq. I developed a piece about the role of women, of American women, as interrogators and torturers, because one of the aspects of the kind of abuse that we learned about after Abu Ghraib was the use of female sexuality as a weapon against Islamic prisoners. So I did a whole series of performances and did an artist book and a video about that aspect of the war on terror. I've also spent a lot of my family is from Cuba. I grew up among Cuban exiles, and I have been involved with working with artists in Cuba since the 1980s. And in the last 10, 15 years or so, I've been very involved with artists who are very politically engaged, and many of whom have gone to prison or been expelled from the country. And after Fidel Castro stepped down from power, and it was clear that a certain era was ending, many of us were sort of looking at not only what it would mean, what was coming in the future, like how would the revolution end, but also going back to chapters in the past that had been censored or inaccessible to younger generations to draw bridges between past and present. And so in this sense, this is more of the work that I do that I would say relates to ghosts. Because for many younger Cuban artists, there are the ghosts of the past are still with them, and in many different ways, because histories repeat themselves, because patterns of repression repeat themselves, because there are stories and artworks and works of literature that have been disappeared from official record, but that pop up and appear in one form or another. So a lot of work that I've done in the last few years has dealt with this. In this slide, I just wanted to show you a little bit of the past, like what are the ghosts? On the cartoon from the 1960s, where you see these revolutionary militiamen stamping out the presence of Western culture. So it's got the Beatles and different masters of ceremonies from American television, newscasters, and beatniks and hippies. This was a period in Cuba in which there were forced labor camps for nonconformists. So who was considered a nonconformist? You could be a hippie, somebody who was gay, somebody who was a Christian and remained very tied to or faithful to their religion, and you'd be sent to a forced labor camp for quote unquote re-education. Then there's just another important example is the crisis in 1980, which is known in the United States as the Mariel boat lift, because in 3 months, 125,000 Cubans left the island on boats to come to the United States. Some of you may have seen the film Scarface, starring Al Pacino, which is a sort of Hollywood take on the Marielitos, or the emigres that came to Miami. In that film, he plays a kind of coke dealer, drug dealer who himself, goes crazy. But in Cuba, the crisis begins not at Mariel, which is a port, but at the Peruvian embassy in Havana, because a small group of Cubans that wanted to leave the country got into a bus and basically broke through the gate of the embassy to ask for political asylum. And in the process of doing this, a guard for the embassy was killed. And so Fidel Castro got angry and said, okay, we're not going to guard the Peruvian embassy anymore, took the guards away. And within 24 hours, 10,000 people had gotten stormed into the embassy to try to flee the country. So in that period, this was the first really mass uprising against the regime, where people were revealing that they weren't so happy with things, that they did want to find a way out. And as a retaliation against those that were manifesting their discontent, there were marches and also acts of repudiation against gays. So I just wanted to show a little bit of documentation. So this is the embassy where all the thousands of people are crowding in, trying to get out. And here are the boats, and here's the march of the revolutionaries against them, right by the embassy. And they're going to, when the sound comes on, you're going to hear ping pong fuera bajo la gusanera, which means, get out, get out. Worms. And here's the gay guy being repudiated publicly. So the yegua literally in English means mare, but it's a derogatory term for an effeminate man in Cuban Spanish. Okay, we got enough there. Got to go on here. So, the kind of ghost of the past in terms of the relationship to work I do in the present, it's in the late 60s, 70s, and 80s, there were several campaigns of persecution against Cuban literary figures and artists for being critical of the regime, for being gay, for any number of things, or for being considered too bourgeois. Because we're talking here about people who were adults when the Cuban Revolution started, and so they always could easily be accused of having been ruined intellectually and politically by the prior regime and untransformable into revolutionary subjects. So of these, Virgilio Piñeras was a very famous writer. Servando Cabrera Moreno was a homosexual painter who was, kicked out of his job as a teacher. Gay people were not allowed to teach during this period, so they would be removed from if they had any kind of teaching post at a university or art school or anything. Lezama Lima, some of these people like Piñera and Lezama Lima got what is called in Cuban slang plan pijama, the pajama plan, where you just were under permanent house arrest and couldn't do anything, or given like really boring jobs at the back of an office where nobody could see you. Reinaldo Arenas is probably the best known, at least in the English-speaking world, because many of his novels have been translated. He was imprisoned in the 70s for being gay and also for being a dissident against the Cuban government. Eventually managed to get out in 1980, wrote an autobiography called Before Night Falls, which was made into a feature film by Julian Schnabel, and got a lot of attention. And so he's become very well known, at least in the United States and Europe, because there's all this information about him in English. But Eberto Padilla, a poet about whom I've made 3 different art projects, and I'll talk about one of them today, was the kind of key legal case that became the paradigm for measuring how to destroy an artist in any number of steps. Padilla was a very famous, probably the most famous and internationally celebrated. Can you have to hold on a second? My son is calling. What is it? Listen, I am in the middle of a conference. Is there something that I need to do? Okay, all right, bye-bye. Sorry. I didn't know if he was locked out or what. Anyway, Padilla was the most famous poet in the 60s, started the Cuban press office in the Soviet Union, and worked in Europe and in New York as well. Came back to Cuba in the mid-60s after doing this, and published a book of poems that was critical of authoritarianism in general, mostly reflecting on what he had seen in the Soviet Union. He became friends there with many dissident poets, and that sort of catalyzed his fall from grace. He was eventually, he was under surveillance for a long time, kicked out of every possible job, and eventually was arrested in 1971. For about a month and a half, was subject to interrogations at state security. His wife was also arrested, and eventually he was forced to make a public confession in which he denounced himself as a counter-revolutionary, and his wife and several of his friends. And this was a case that was infamous. His confession was filmed, it was transcribed. The transcription of the confession was published and circulated to all these embassies, and then went out to the international press. And the Cuban government thought that this would act as proof that they were right and he was wrong, but it produced the opposite effect of all these intellectuals that had been supporting the Cuban Revolution, like Simón de Beauvoir, like Julio Cortázar, like Mario Vargas Llosa and others, started writing letters against to support Padilla. So here on the left, you see some stills from the filming of his confession, which was suppressed for almost 50 years. It's only now that some of the evidence is coming out in films. And the first page of the publication that was circulated to all the embassies and to the press So the whole thing backfired in 71, and Padilla was basically left without a job and without any ability to have a public life in Cuba, living in a kind of house arrest until 1980, when finally Susan Sontag and Senator Ted Kennedy managed to get him out. And then he lived in the United States for about 20 more years and then passed away. But he was never the same after that experience. But that moment, that was like the moment of rupture, when after 10 or 12 years of kind of everybody on the left in the United States and Europe and Latin America celebrating Cuba, there was a split, and there were some more hardline people who stuck with the government, and others who left and said, you are not interested in this anymore, this is too repressive. So a lot of what I'm trying, when I say a ghost, I said these are connections to be made to the current situation. There's the case of Luis Manuel Otero Alcántara, about an artist about whom I've written many, many times, who's a performance artist who's now serving a 5-year sentence for doing performances with the Cuban flag. And here in the sand, he did a piece called The Flag Belongs to All in 2019 in response to the imposition of a law regulating the use of the Cuban flag. And so he would, I think it was for a month, he just did everything with this flag. He slept with the flag, he ate with the flag, he traveled with the flag, he went to the beach with the flag, and kept photographing himself and circulating this on social media and encouraging others to do so. And there was a group exhibition at this time of different artists doing artworks with the flag. So, this happened in 2019. He was arrested at one point and held for a while, and there was concern that he was going to be in prison for it, but he was eventually released. But in 2021, when there was the largest mass protest that there had been in Cuba since the beginning of the revolution in 59, he was arrested on his way to the protest, and then they decided 2 years later to try him for what he had done in 2019 and sentence him to 5 years. So he's an Amnesty International prisoner of conscience. He was declared in 2021 one of the 100 most influential people in the world on Time magazine by the Chinese artist Ai Weiwei. And he's tried to get paroled twice and been denied. And he's in a maximum security prison surrounded by assassins and people doing life sentences. He's not together with other political prisoners. There are about 1,070 political prisoners in Cuba right now, and they're all spread out all over the country so that they don't join together to create any political activity inside the prisons. And another case that relates to what happened to Padilla and the others in the past is the case of Hamlet Labastida, another colleague with whom I've collaborated many times, a visual artist. His work has for 20 years dealt with the iconography of the repressive state apparatus and the rhetoric of the state that rationalizes repression. So some of his works, they're all stenciled works. Some of them are of excerpts of texts from famous speeches from the 60s and 70s that people have forgotten, but that kind of predict what will happen in the future. And some are more visual, like the work behind him in the photograph, where he's playing with the iconography of different, like of the Revolutionary Police, the Ministry of the Interior, and so on. He was in a artist residency in Berlin in 2020, from 2020 to 2021. He flew back to Cuba at the end of his residency in June of 2021. He was arrested upon arrival, and he was accused of, it's called instigating to commit a crime. He himself didn't commit a crime, but he was accused of encouraging others to commit a crime. That accusation came because he had been in group chats, supposedly private group chats with other artists, thinking about different activist strategies. And he proposed an art project that was to create stamps with the logos of different opposition groups and put and stamp different banknotes, Cuban banknotes. And his friends in the chat said, you know, it's too dangerous, it's against the law, we're going to get arrested, we can't do it. So they didn't do it. Nobody did it. And then he flies back to Cuba and he's immediately arrested when he lands. He was detained at the headquarters of state security for 3 months. In the summer of 2021, all his friends were trying to figure out how to get him out. And one of the things that we did was to actually interpret his proposal, to make stamps, but not just put the logos of opposition groups, but also put free Hamlet and that art should be free and that art is not a crime. And the performance took place in Madrid at the Arco Art Fair, and then also at a fair called Untitled in Miami. He was finally released in September of 2021 and basically taken out of state security and put on an airplane and shipped back to Europe. So now he's in exile. He was warned that if he came back, he would be imprisoned again. So he is now living in Berlin. So now I get to my a little bit more about some of these projects. So this project was called Two Undiscovered Amerindians Visit the West, and it's probably the art project that most students read about when they read about me, because it got we were in the Whitney Biennial and traveled all over Europe, and we did this piece at a time when there was just the beginning of a conversation about multiculturalism and cultural diversity in the United States. And it was, to my mind, a very uncritical conversation and a very celebratory, uncritical conversation, shall we say. And so Guillermo and I wanted to inject a little bit more irony and a little bit more critique into the discussion of cultural diversity. And so we decided, and 1992, which was the year that we started this project, was the year of the 500th anniversary of Christopher Columbus's journeys to the Americas. The US government made a lot of fanfare about this. They had an official, Columbus celebration fund, and were planning all sorts of ceremonies all over the place. And many Native Americans were planning protests against this. And so we wanted to figure out, we were invited to do a performances at a festival in Madrid and London, and we wanted to figure out how we could create a performance that would comment on the quincentenary or the 500th anniversary in a critical way. And so the idea we had was to exhibit ourselves as oddities, as ethnographic oddities. And we were working off of the research that we had done about the history of the ethnographic display, or better known as the human zoo. So in this picture, we're in Madrid at the Columbus Plaza. So yeah, as I said, we were invited to do this, and we wanted to join this broader movement to critique the idea of discovery. What you see in the photograph here is one of the Belcourt brothers, who was in Minneapolis. And he was one of the, Vernon Belcourt, one of the leaders of the American Indian movement at the time. He went to, I guess, a natural history museum there, where they had a replica of a Spanish caravel, one of the ships that had sailed with Columbus to the Americas, and he took a pint of his blood and threw it at the caravel in a kind of performative protest, just as an example of the kinds of things that were going on when we did our piece. So we started doing research, and I read in this book by Sander Gilman called Difference in Pathology about Ashanti people in Africa that were put on display at the Prater, which is a park in Vienna in the 1880s. And at the time, I had not heard of human zoos. So this was all new to me. And I was kind of shocked, because in the account that I read, it mentioned that, the Europeans that were coming to see them in the park wanted to see them go to the bathroom in front of others, which is extremely humiliating. And but it just hit me that, there was, however tragic and abject this was, that there was something in there that we could use to make a performance. So we started doing more and more research and finding so many examples of ethnographic displays of people from Africa, Asia, and Latin America that were brought to Europe and then to the United States to be put on display in parks and zoos and world fairs, and sometimes in aristocratic salons. And then in the late 19th century, there was a phenomenon at least in New York and some other cities, called dime museums, which were like freak show museums. In downtown Manhattan, for example, there was one on the Bowery where you would pay a dime is 10 cents, and then go see all sorts of oddities, people with physical deformities, and then also people from, from sub-Saharan Africa or from Central America on display alongside the others with deformities. A very famous case you see here at the right of the Hottentot Venus, or Sarah Bartman, who was from the southern part of Africa. There are ethnic groups there where the women are very pear-shaped. So they have very large hips and buttocks. And but the depiction here is exaggerated, but nonetheless, there was a belief among some at the time in the 19th century that the large size of her buttocks was indication of a larger vagina, and therefore of her being closer to non-human animals, of her bestiality. And she was displayed in the early 19th century in Paris and London naked, so that people could come and examine her buttocks. And after her death, her genitals were removed from the rest of her body and put in formaldehyde and kept at the Museum of Man in Paris as a kind of exotic, odd thing or artifact. And this was sort of there's not really information that was circulated until late in the 20th century, when an article appeared in a natural history magazine, and this caused an uproar. And since then, there are numerous African-American women writers, for example, who have written plays and novels and other books about Sarah Bartman. And eventually, at, I believe, the end of the 20th century, it was that the South African government negotiated to have her remains returned to South Africa and given a proper burial. In the case of Pip and Flip, here you have an example of how people who suffered from disabilities and genetically induced deformities were then used as evidence of the intellectual inferiority of an entire group. These two people who were presented as Pip and Flip were microcephalic, so they were born with the brains were too small, and as were their skulls, but they were presented as representatives of Mayans from the Yucatan. Here you have an example of people from the Philippines on display in 1904 at Coney Island. So we gathered all these examples, historical examples, and we had posters around our cage with a chronology that outlined all of this history. And then, to suggest to people that we were commemorating this. But in our performance, we did not act like professors talking about, what was happening. We were just there supposedly as the latest iteration of the human zoo. So we couldn't speak any Western language. Everywhere we went, we were presented by docents in uniform who would explain our identity to the audience and feed us and take us to the bathroom on leashes and so on and so forth. To kind of dramatize that split between self and other that had been part of the sort of logic of the original displays. And we thought that it would be obvious that we were not real, but there were some people who believed that we were in fact from this island that doesn't exist. You know, I will never really understand how that is so, but that is what happened. And so the performance became kind of infamous because of that, because of the dynamic that unfolded in front of it, of people who believed, people who were in shock, people who were enraged, people who were laughing, and so on and so forth. But we had to figure out in the course of this of how to get our ideas across without being literal, right? How to get to the bathroom, were we going to sleep in the cage? We tried and decided that it was just too uncomfortable, and then we didn't have enough energy to go through the second or third day of the piece. But we came up with a modality that worked, where if you paid a certain amount of money, I would do a dance, or Guillermo would tell a story in his native language, which was all just gibberish. Or if you paid a bit more, you could have a photograph, a Polaroid photograph taken with us. So we were sort of mocking the kind of dynamic that had unfolded in front of these human zoos in the past. So that's one. And now I made a documentary about the audience reaction to that performance. I wrote an essay, and I still get letters from students who are writing papers about it some 30 years later, asking me to talk about it, which is a bit tedious, but that's what happens when the work that you do gets picked up. That was just sort of what happened. A lot of my other pieces nobody asked me about, but that one people asked me about a lot. So another version of this kind of monstrous figure I had mentioned before was my playing Dr. Zira in a performance called Observation of Predation in Humans. And as I said, this was my way of thinking about what to do with the predatory practices of bankers in the wake of the 2008 crisis and the Occupy Wall Street protests in 2011. So the performance is like a lecture by a scientist, but I'm the scientist, and I look like a chimp. And I was working off of, here you see the original film of Planet of the Apes, and there's the original Zira in the middle with her husband Cornelius, and Charlton Heston, the human that has through time travel arrived in this Earth in the future, when most humans have been killed by nuclear war, and the only other mammals that have survived are other primates other than not humans. So anyway, I developed this PowerPoint lecture that I deliver as if I am Dr. Zira about the predatory practices of human beings. So, in the original 5 films, which are really interesting works of science fiction from the early days of science fiction and film, there's a kind of ape city, which is where Dr. Zira lives with, she's part of the chimpanzee class. Then there's the orangutan class and the baboon and the gorilla class. And so the baboons are more like the judges, the chimps are more like the scientists and the intellectuals, and the gorillas are like the police and the army. And it's a kind of distorted mirror of human society. And it's a kind of, basically the idea is that these other primates have watched humans destroy themselves, and so they've developed an alternative way of living so that they can survive. They have very limited access to technology. There are strict territorial limits. So there's a forbidden zone, which is where human beings used to be. There's a very marked social hierarchy that can't be interfered with. There's a very strict adherence to religion. And human beings, if there are any, are subjugated, segregated from the other primates and subjugated. So they're trapped and, put away just like we treat non-human animals. But I was interested in the sort of messages of these films because I could, in the same way that in the late 60s and early 70s, these films were devised to make a critique of nuclear war and, the sort of predatory practices of human beings in relationship to the earth, I was like, well, what if we consider the dominant attitudes and practices of neoliberalism through this kind of interspecies comparison? In other words, how much are we like other primates in our predatory behavior, and what does that, how much does that innate similarity, what does that have to do with you know, our social formations, our political formations, and our economic practices? So in my research, I did talk to primatologists. I wanted to learn how they talk so that I could imitate them in my character. And I spent a lot of time listening to lectures by Robert Sapolsky, who's a very famous neuroscientist here who studies the relationship between, you know, brains in humans and brains in other great apes, and particularly in baboons. And he's really funny. You know, one of the things that I learned from him, besides the science, was that scientists in his field make these kinds of comparisons between humans and other primates all the time, and make all kinds of jokes about it. So I was like, oh, I'm onto something. That's how scientists think about human beings as well. So, you know, this book was very helpful to me in developing my script because it was about, you know, comparing human beings to other great apes. You know, one thing that the authors talk about is the relationship between what happens to mammals when they're in captivity, like when they're in zoos, trapped in zoos, versus what happens to human beings when they are impoverished. So in a sense, they're entrapped, maybe not literally in a cage, but they can't really get out of the situation they're in, and many feel entrapped by poverty. So malnutrition and obesity are common among impoverished human beings in the United States, and eating disorders are very common among zoo animals and mammals in zoos. The sense of fatalism, of seeing that you can't really control your life, is very common among impoverished human beings, and you get depression and boredom and sexual dysfunction in mammals that are in captivity. You get illiteracy and self-injury as a result of stress among human beings who are impoverished, and you get diminished survival skills among mammals in captivity, and self-injury as well. Social network disintegration and disrupted family relations. So it's like we react, the animal in us reacts very much in the same way as other mammals do when they're in captivity. So I was thinking about all of these things as I'm developing my performance lecture, like what can I say, right, about human beings using the language of animal psychology. So, you know, here I am at the Studio Museum in Harlem, which is where I started touring with this piece, talking about the brain, the human brain. And then a lot of the humor in the piece has to do with comparing great apes with human beings. So, you know, talking about baboons as alpha males, and then talking about this guy is the head of Goldman Sachs, the big investment firm, as an alpha male, and talking about the similarity in his behavior to then equivocant tendencies in baboons. And so here you see them stealing things from human beings. And then, you know, our tendency to hoard is very much like the tendencies of some great apes also to hoard, but we hoard in a different way by hoarding money and hoarding food and so on. We have predatory scavenging, so looking at animals that survive through scavenging, and then human beings that are put because of their poverty in a situation in which they also have to scavenge. So that, I mean, that, you know, some of the comparisons strike people as, you know, make them very sad. Some seem very funny, but I was able to communicate a lot about kind of take down, how to put it, I guess, yeah, to take down the bankers, because in our society, we celebrate people who make a lot of money. We treat millionaires as heroes. We depict them as the greatest expressions of the American spirit, and yet they are stealing from the rest of us, and there's not really a critique of that behavior. So I was trying to deliver that and find a language for that by, coming in as a kind of monstrous being, right? As a non-human person, a non-human entity to speak. So going back to the notion of ghosts and Cuba, here's just one example of one of the projects that I did using the figure of Padilla, of Alberto Padilla, the poet who was forced to speak against himself as a kind of, it's the Cuban version of the Stalinist purges of the 1930s. So 2021 was the 50th anniversary of the forced confession from 1971. So in honor of that 50th anniversary, I worked with 20 contemporary Cuban artists and writers, and we took the transcript of his confession, which had been published in 71, and divided it up among the 20 people, and each one read their part, and then we put it together like a kind of exquisite corpse of the entire confession. Here we just see some of the stills. This was during COVID, so everybody, we couldn't join, we couldn't physically meet anywhere, and everybody was looking at art on the internet. So the idea was to, I got everybody to use their phones to record themselves, and then worked on it here with my editor, and filtered all the material to make it look like the old 16mm black and white newsreel footage that was done of the original confession. And then we streamed this via 5 different museums on different continents on the day in April of the anniversary of the original confession. And it was really interesting because most intellectuals in Cuba know about the Padilla case, but none of the people that participated had actually read everything that he said. And when they did, it made them feel really uncomfortable and like ill. Like people said, I'm getting nightmares, because they realized how much, well, first of all, how terrible it was, the things that he was forced to say, but also how similar his situation was to their situation. So it was kind of it was a gesture that was a kind of activist gesture, but through an artwork. But it was also a reckoning for many of them with the way in which the ghosts of the past were still in the present. So anyway, that's it.